All right, good afternoon. I'm Brian Marshall, and today we're going to talk about sending Hyperion Planning to the cloud. So our agenda today, we're going to start off with some introductions and go into why we would choose something like PVCS. Then we're going to go into some of the more specifics around how we migrate that to the cloud, including plan types, calculations, load rules, report scripts, security, all the components that make up PVCS, and then some of the pieces a little bit outside of that, automation and testing. And then we're going to go through an actual case study of having migrated a client from a relatively complex set of applications to a single PVCS application. So about US Analytics. So US Analytics was founded in 1999. We've got over 15 years of continuous experience in business growth, specific in the Hyperion segment of Oracle's EPM stack. And we've got over 65 professionals, and we're a full-service organization. We cover process advisory, infrastructure implementations, upgrades and migrations, training. We have managed services, and then from a solutions perspective, we do planning, forecasting, consolidations, and everything else you can think of on the EPM stack. We're also the 2015 Oracle TOLA EPM Partner of the Year, which is a pretty high honor. A little bit about me. So I've been at US Analytics since 2002, so right at about 14 years. I've been on over 100 projects. I've presented at Kaleidoscope since 2010. I'm an Oracle ACE associate, and if you've read my blog at HyperionEPM.com, I post there pretty frequently. I'm over our planning and S-based practice in addition to our consolidations team. So if it's on the app side, that's kind of my ballpark. So why would we choose PVCS over, say, a traditional on-prem solution? One of the biggest benefits of PVCS is going to be the initial upfront costs. So we don't have to purchase any hardware. We don't have to purchase any software. It's just going to be a subscription. So depending on which version, and we'll get into the different versions that are available, it's just going to be a flat per user cost. Another big benefit for some organizations is going to be less IT involvement. And that can be twofold. One of those is going to be that IT is already probably overtaxed and not necessarily overfunded. They're normally underfunded. And this gives us a way of taking one more thing off their plate. The other way to look at that is you may have IT that is pushing you to go one way, but you want to go another way, and PVCS can give you a way to be a little bit more independent on your tool selection and what you choose to implement. From a total cost of ownership perspective, overall it's going to be cheaper, especially in the first 3 years or so. Once you get past about 3 years, things will start to become a little bit more of a wash when you look at the overall total cost of ownership. So up front, we don't have any hardware maintenance costs. We don't have any IT-related costs. We don't have any annual software maintenance that we have to pay. And we're not going to have an upgrade every few years. And depending on how complex your set of applications are, an upgrade can be a significant cost. But if you look at the overall costs over a 3-year period, it's going to be roughly break even depending on the number of users you have and the overall cost of your infrastructure to support those. And then one of the biggest reasons we're going to select PVCS is it's got all of the functionality of a tool that's been around for a very long time in Hyperion Planning. So PVCS originated sharing a code base with Hyperion Planning. So you're talking about a code base that's over a decade old, that's built on top of S-Base, which is over 2 decades old, and at the end of the day is probably the most stable piece of the EPM stack that Oracle offers today. Which is a big part of the reason when they started down the path of, hey, we're gonna move everything to the cloud. Our first product is going to be based on something we're comfortable with, and that was Hyperion Planning, and that's how PVCS came into existence. So now the question is, which PVCS? And we have 2 offerings on the PVCS side. We've got the original offering that's been out for over 2 years now. And that's just PVCS. It comes with 3 VSO plan types, 3 ASO plan types, and 1 additional consolidated reporting cube, which is also an ASO plan type. The cost for that solution is $120 per user per month. And the more users you buy, you'll find that Oracle will drop that price down. It depends on whether you're a mid-market or an up-market. It'll make a determination on how much of a discount you can really get, especially how big of an implementation you're looking to undertake. On the E-PBCS side, or really it's Enterprise Planning Cloud, EPC, but everybody's been calling it E-PBCS since it was a rumored product before it actually came out. This has all the things you get with PVCS, so the 3ASO, 3BSO, and the consolidated reporting cube. But it also comes with some pre-built modules. And I think it's an important distinction when we talk about the modules that exist in planning. As much of PVCS is built on and takes from Hyperion Planning, the pre-built modules are a little bit of a departure from that. So traditionally, we have workforce, CapEx, and the project financial planning piece. The difference in how those work and how those are configured is pretty vast when we start talking about the cloud version of these modules. So on-prem, we have a lot of functionality and flexibility where we can go in and make modifications to the business rules and the templates behind those business rules. When we look at it from an E-PBCS perspective, it's all wizard-driven. So there's very little that we can actually modify inside of those plan types. One of the biggest limitations that brings along with it is going to be, if I want to set up my own custom workforce, I really have to use my own custom plan types. I can't use the pre-built workforce and make significant modifications to it on the back end. And what that really means is that one of two things has to happen. Either your business already has to be very similar to the way that the process is built inside of E-PBCS, or you have to be willing to change your business process to fit the way that E-PBCS allows you to do that process. The other thing is obviously the cost. So it's a little bit more than double the cost of your traditional PVCS overall software licensing cost. And again, this is just a monthly fee, so this includes all of your hardware, all of your software. It includes 2 instances, 1 development instance and 1 production instance. So there's a lot that comes with that, and it's just a monthly fee, so we don't have to worry about any capitalized expense up front around paying $1 million for software. So if I'm migrating to the cloud, what version of planning do I need to be on for this to be a relatively straightforward process? If you're on 11.121 or greater, it's going to be, a lot of that's going to be pretty simple. LCM will take a fair amount of your application. And we'll cover, as we go through this, we'll cover the basics of what will and won't make that trip. If you're prior to 11.121, it's not actually supported to go back that far with LCM. That's not to say you can't make that migration, but the recommended path is to upgrade that application to a newer version of planning and then migrate it after that. Your other option is to basically rebuild it using artifacts from your prior to 11.121 version. So you could take all of the different dimensionality, and we can extract all of those out and then just put those back in with a relative ease. And some of that will go pretty easily, but when you get into forms and things like that, there's a lot of work you have to do that you probably don't necessarily want to do unless your application just is stagnant and needs an upgrade anyway. So migrating plan types. We really have to evaluate how many plan types you need to migrate. And this is where we get into some of the questions around, how many applications are we talking? So many clients we go into, they don't just have one planning application. Some do, and a lot do, but a lot don't. And if we have, if we have 3 different planning applications, can we just combine 3 planning applications together into one PVCS pod, or do we have to separate those out into separate pods? Another question we have to ask is, do we have existing modules like workforce, CapEx, and project financial planning? If we have those, we might be able to still migrate depending on the number of plan types we need to occupy as we make that migration. Do we have other plan types that interface with those? And that's where it gets a little bit trickier. Or do we need to migrate independent of those 3 plan types and rebuild maybe using E-PBCS instead? And the biggest question that's going to come out of that is, how many total BSO plan types do we have, and how many total ASO plan types do we have? If we have too many plan types, do we need to do something a little bit different, like convert our plan types over to ASO to free up some of our BSO plan types, or do we need to consolidate plan types? And we'll cover some of those when we get to the end on our case study, where we had to make some of these decisions to determine what makes the most sense as we start to consolidate applications. Another big thing that's going to help you understand whether you can consolidate those applications or not is how similar they are in dimensionality, and not just the number of dimensions and the type of dimensions, but the members that are actually in those dimensions. So if I have an account dimension for one set of applications that has 1,000 members, and another plan type that would have another 1,000 members, and those aren't at all similar and there's no overlap, then we have to start having a conversation about, okay, maybe those don't belong together, or if the dimensionality is just completely different, maybe those don't belong together. And we've had that conversation with multiple clients around, how do we do that consolidation effort? How do we rationalize what we have into something that we can fit into a single cloud-based application? So that takes us into another detail piece around calculations. So there are two basic pieces that we have to talk about from a planning perspective if we're going from on-prem onto the cloud. Now, the first is business rules, and then we've got calculation scripts. So for business rules, it's not too difficult unless you're on an older version using like business rule server. So if you use Calculation Manager, then LCM can take all of your calculations and migrate them. The way that they've set it up in the cloud, we still have shared services. It still splits out Calc Manager from the main planning application, so we can just migrate those using LCM and make any modifications that we need to once it's over in Calc Manager on the cloud. With Business Rule Server, it's a little bit more complex. So on Business Rule Server, we have to basically take all of our existing rules and convert them over, and that may require a lot of manual effort depending on what version you're on. Some clients will choose to try and run the migration utility on-prem and then take it to the cloud, but if you don't use Calc Manager, or that's not a familiar product for you, a lot of our clients will just choose to say, okay, this is a chance for us to go through and say, how many of these business rules that exist out here do we actually even need? We may have 100 business rules that we need to migrate, or we may look at that 100 business rules and go, you know what, we only actually ever use 20 of these, and the other 80 of these that we're looking at are either something we used during development, something we used for testing, or something we used once and then never used again, and we can go ahead and delete that. So it's another chance for us to look at what we've got out there and start to rationalize things and say, hey, this is a chance for me to get a cleaner application as we push to the cloud. Calc scripts are a little more tricky. So for calculation scripts, they don't actually exist inside of PVCS. So if you go through and you try and import them to LCM, it's just going to tell you, hey, we can't do calc scripts, so that wasn't imported. It's going to give you an error. So this means we have to do a manual conversion to business rules. Now, for the most part, that's relatively simple. We go create a business rule in Calc Manager. We copy it and we paste it over, and our fixed statements and everything, all of our syntax will be exactly the same. We validate it, and we're done. But there will be some things that maybe you want to, again, look at that and say, hey, do I need to rationalize how many of these calc scripts that we have out there? When we look at business rules in Calc Manager, what I find is that most clients don't have all that many business rules. They have a lot of calc scripts. We use business rules on forms. We use business rules as part of our process and task lists and things like that. So we have a certain defined number of those that get used all the time, and they're pretty easy to identify. But with calc scripts, it's a little bit different. With calc scripts, we've got the ability as an administrator to go through and create a lot of calc scripts kind of on the fly. And it's really common for an admin to go in and say, hey, I need to go run this just for this time period, and I don't want to go ahead and change one of my normal ones that I execute. I'm just going to go create a copy of it, modify it, and save it as. And now I've done that 100 times, and now I have 100 extra calc scripts that we need to look at and say, hey, do we use these enough that it makes sense to even migrate those, or should we? Or if we're going to migrate them, maybe this is a great opportunity for us to take 4 different calc scripts that run for 4 different time periods and say, you know what, we're going to turn that into a variable, and we're going to make that work inside of a business rule, and it gives us a chance to streamline what we're doing from a calculation perspective inside of PVCS. Because again, one of our goals as we make this migration is, how do we make sure that we have the cleanest thing possible that we're working with once we get things to the cloud? So next up is load rules, and load rules just flat out don't exist in PVCS. So we have to look at each load rule and determine what makes the best sense for each of those load rules. And this means that if we have a load rule like a SQL-based load rule inside of Essbase, we have to do something different. And that really leaves us with 3 options. So we've got FDMEE, or they actually call it data management inside of PVCS, and that's the cloud-based version. So when you log into your PVCS application and you go in there, you'll see a data management piece under your administration. So that's the cloud-based version, and it's got a certain set of limitations. Like, it will only work with flat files, so you have to define an import format. And then you can basically use only flat files with that system. The one exception to that rule is if you're a Fusion GL customer and you use the cloud-based Fusion piece, then you can actually go use it to connect to a web service as part of the September update. And we're actually implementing that right now. It actually does work, which is pretty cool. The other option is to go with FDME on-prem. And the on has the capability of loading data directly to our cloud. So what that means is if you do have SQL-based load rules, then maybe FDME makes the most sense for you. Maybe you need to buy a license or 10 of that to do your on-prem manipulation of data and then send it to the cloud. Our last option is the native S-based format. And the native S-based format is important for performance reasons. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we get to our case study. But at the end of the day, what you'll find is that, as you would expect, the native S-based format is the fastest way to load data. It's not necessarily the best way, but it's the fastest way. So what about report scripts? So report scripts, like load rules, don't exist anymore. And really, this is not that big of a deal, because what we find for most of our clients is that report scripts aren't really used all that often. Honestly, most of my clients that still use report scripts are doing it because there's no other way to get data out of like an ASO queue. Like I don't have a data export command inside of ASO. So report scripts were a quick way to do that. So that functionality is going to be gone. So we have to figure out a different way to do that. And there are a couple of ways that we have that we can do things now. So one way is to use the native PVCS utilities to export data. Well, that's kind of ugly and not very useful, but you can do it. It's a way to get data out rapidly. If you need to go do a one-off extract of data, you can put it into a format that you can open up in Excel, do a little bit of work with, and have a usable format. But we wouldn't typically use that to say, automate the process. Another option is to use business rules. So just like in Calc Manager, or just like in calculation scripts, we have the data export command. We can still use that data export command. It still exists inside of business rules inside of PVCS. This is not documented, so it's not one of those things that if you call Oracle and say, hey, this isn't working right, I'm not entirely sure what the answer is going to be on that. Because we've used it and it does work. You can export data that way, and basically it puts it into the data management outbox so that you can go pick that up with, say, EPM Automate and download it to another application or process it with FDME. But that's another option. And then our last option is to use data management itself, whether that's going to be the cloud-based version of data management or the full FDME suite of your on-prem tools. And that'll essentially produce a flat file, or if you're using the on-prem version, it could even potentially go into a table as part of your ODI scripts. So there are several options, but at the end of the day, report scripts are going to go away. So you just need to, and we've been telling clients this for a long time, that report scripts aren't necessarily the right way to go. So this kind of gives us that chance to force the best practice of not using them anymore. Financial reports are a little bit more murky. So obviously, financial reports is a big piece of the cloud-based offering for PVCS in any of the EPM stack. And if all of your reports use planning-based connections, then you can LCM those over and convert them over with relative ease. If any of your reports are using an S-based connection, though, if you're using an S-based connection to your planning queue inside of Report Studio, that's where you start running into issues, because we don't have the option to pull in an S-based financial report. So now we have to basically build that from scratch, because we have to go redefine our grid as a grid defined to planning. So we have to go build that report again. Now we can use it as a basis, and there's probably a way to do some of this if we were to open up the XML files that exist inside of LCM, and even the files that we download from say Explore through Workspace. So there are other ways to possibly do that, but a lot of those are going to end up being more time-consuming to figure out how to do it than to just go do it manually. And again, this gives us a chance to start rationalizing how many of these reports do we really need. Now, if you come to me and you say, hey, I've got 600 reports and all 600 use S-based connections and we want to go to the cloud, I probably won't have the same answer of, hey, let's just go do this manually. We probably will try and find a more automated way of doing that, but that wouldn't be my first choice for most clients, because at the end of the day, most clients don't have all that many reports. We're normally talking about 50 or less. If you have reports that connect to SBase or HFM in addition to planning, we'll have to split those reports up. So one of the big limitations when we start looking at the cloud versus on-prem, on-prem, if I have FR, I can sit that on top of SBase planning and HFM. And technically speaking, I can have one report that has a grid for each of those applications, or I can have a grid that goes to multiple applications. So, or multiple grids that go to multiple applications across the same planning instance. So if it's inside of a planning instance, so different plan types, you're okay. But if you depart from inside of the plan types and you're either using an SBase connection or an HFM connection, those are going to have to be split out. And what that means is we're now going to have to go through and redefine how those reports and how the end users interface with those reports. Because I can't, as a user, there's no interface for me to log into HFM and still have access to PVCS FR. Conversely, if I log into FR on PVCS, I'm not going to see HFM stuff. So now I have two separate reporting tracks if I have multiple pieces of the EPM stack out there. So that's another thing we'll have to look at and figure out what makes the most sense for fixing that. Another issue you're going to find is that we're likely going to have to rebuild your security. And this kind of goes across, and we'll talk about security a little bit later, but security is one of those things where they've changed the entire underlying security model that exists inside of PVCS to make it cloud-based. Native security doesn't exist the same way that it used to, so native groups don't exist the same way that they used to. And then the way that we do Active Directory security is 100% different than it was in on-prem, where it was all through shared services. So we'll get into that in more detail a little bit later. So from a security perspective, a very little bit later, from a security perspective, we basically have a couple of things we have to consider. If you're using native Active Directory, then we're going to have to go set up external authentication inside of PVCS, or you're going to have to convert into using native accounts inside of PVCS. Both of these things are going to be done through the admin console. So from an Active Directory perspective, it uses it uses SAML to basically SAML to basically go through and connect to your external security. So this means that there's an IT requirement that you have either something like the Microsoft product that does that, or another third-party tool that will produce the proper XML ask and response and all of the things required to configure external authentication. Because essentially what's happening is you go to log into PVCS, and PVCS says, oh, I see that this is configured for external authentication. So it forwards you to a landing spin that then gets passed back to PVCS that says, hey, they are authenticated, and here's who they're authenticated as. Let them pass. And that whole thing happens through SSL, so you're secured. And it keeps all of your passwords completely contained. No passwords are going to be transmitted outside of that external layer. So it's all going to be done through tokens once you get past the login screen. And once you've got everybody added, whether it's an external user or an internal user, then we have to go define security. So what we would normally do in shared services, where we define somebody as an administrator or a planner or a power user or all the different ones that we have, we now do that through the admin console. And we can still do things like import and export those, but at the end of the day, you're going to end up rebuilding your security. It's just going to be a question of whether or not we again do that rationalization when we say, hey, we only have 10 users anyway, let's just go redefine it and make it better. Or do we have 1,000 users and we need to figure out a really good way to automate that process? So again, this is a good time to revisit all of your security needs as we make that migration to the cloud. So automation is another big piece of any migration to the cloud. At the end of the day, I think that most PVCS migrations are going to spend probably 70 to 80% of their time on either automation or security. And very little time will normally be spent on a standard migration of getting, hey, I need my plan types to go to the cloud, I need my forms to go to the cloud. Most of that's going to be handled relatively fast with LCM unless you have a big consolidation effort underway. Automation, on the other hand, is going to be completely different. So if you look at how most planning applications are designed today, there are two pieces, metadata and data, and then the overall scheduling that combines those two pieces. So from a metadata perspective, in the old way of doing things on-prem, we really only have two ways of updating metadata inside, well, three ways of updating metadata inside of planning. We have manual, which obviously would still work the way that it used to work in planning. Then we have ODI. Well, ODI won't work at all because ODI doesn't connect to the cloud, so that option's off the table for the cloud. And then we have the outline load utility. So the outline load utility is great for on-prem users, but it's a lot different for the cloud. So what they've done in the cloud is they've created a new tool called the EPM Automate. And the EPM Automate essentially takes the outline load utility and adds some additional functionality to it, like the ability to upload files and a variety of other features that are kind of independent of what we used to do in just planning, because the EPM Automate tool doesn't just work for PVCS, it spans the as the name would indicate, it spans the EPM stack on the cloud. So what this means is if you're an outline load utility user, then EPM Automate will be a natural progression because it uses the same file formats for all the metadata loads and things like that. And really, you're just going to be changing the way that you batch up those routines. If you're an ODI user, on the other hand, we basically have to start over. We have to take all of your ODI processes. Now, we may still be able to use some of the same files. We may even be able to use pieces of ODI, if that's your internal standard, to say kick off a routine that runs EPM Automate instead of the outline load utility or something, or instead of using the knowledge modules. So there are a lot of different choices about how we get there in the specifics, but you're going to be using EPM Automate one way or another. Then we have to look at our data processes. So from a data perspective, most of our load rules can be a simple translation from, hey, if it's a flat file, I have to go into data management, I define what that flat file looks like in an input format, and then I apply rules to it just like I would in a load rule. And it's a little bit more complex than what we did in our traditional S-based load rules. But the good news is it's a lot better. And it's better because it gives us a lot more functionality and flexibility on top of auditability and visibility. That's a lot of itties. And what that's going to mean is what used to be in a load rule, say I have 3 different translations of data inside of my data load rule itself, well, those get buried inside of the load rule. And if you don't know that they're there and know to go look for them, you might not ever see them. And that's a problem when we start to, if there's turnover on your admin side, or if there's a question as to how data got in there, data management's going to fix all of those, because now data management gives you a single avenue of getting that data in and having auditability of that data. So if I ever wonder how that data got there, all I have to do is go to the data load workbench and find that intersection and say, okay, what rules were used to load this piece of data? One piece that's going to change a little bit is if I have a SQL load rule, it's a little different. And the good news is there are shortcuts around that, because essentially all we need to do is find a quick way of saying, hey, I have this query that's going to, say, a SQL Server database or an Oracle database. I need that in a flat file instead. And then I need to upload that flat file and process that flat file with data management. So it's some extra effort, and this is why when we start talking about, if I'm implementing from scratch, is it longer or shorter on the cloud? My answer is normally it's a little bit longer, because there's a few stops we have to make along the way to fix things like this, where we have to go in and modify what would normally be an S-based load rule, which is relatively quickly to create, and change it into something more complex like data management. And because the built-in data management only supports flat files, we have to do things like add a stop in between SQL Server and data management. And that stop is relatively simple. We can take a query that we've got inside of a load rule and throw that into into a PowerShell script, and execute that PowerShell script that will then generate that into a quick to consume text file. But again, it's another step. It's another set of patience. But there is a built-in scheduling piece. Have an 11.124 if you're on into that. So how about the end user experience? So how much different is it for end users? The answer is it depends. So if you've been on PVCS or if you've purchased PVCS and have a pod out there, and it was before, I want to say the date is, it's either June or July, then if it was before that, you still have the workspace, and workspace still works just fine. If you provisioned it after that, and today if you go buy PVCS, workspace no longer exists as part of the interface. So you can't even go turn it on manually. It just isn't there. So that means there's going to be a significant difference between if you have users that only use Workspace today, now they have to get acquainted to the simplified interface. From an admin perspective, that also means that you're going to have 100 extra clicks for anything you do in the simplified interface. So if you're an on-prem and you have access to the simplified interface and start getting used to it. The other thing we've noticed with that interface in Workspace, especially around the admin side, not so much the end user side, but things have moved around from patch to patch. So when we had a patch in June that was a major patch, and we had a patch in September that was not as major of a patch, things still moved around in the back-end interface so that we had to start looking for them and finding them. So there's a little bit of movement still going on as they hash out exactly what the simplified interface is going to look like long-term. I think that'll settle down over time, but just keep that in mind. Things may move around a bit on you. Multiple pods and multiple logins, what does that mean? So a PVCS instance is called a pod in Oracle terms. And what that means is if I have to take two completely independent planning applications and migrate them to the cloud, I can only do so using two separate pods, because they're going to have different dimensionality, different plan types, different data sources. All of that stuff will be different between those two. And if we can't consolidate those into a single pod, then we have to split them out into separate applications. And the only way to split those out is into separate pods. What that means is if I have a user that connects to both, they're going to have to log into two different websites. Two different versions of Workspace that you have today will now exist for those users that have crossover between the two different applications. That also has ramifications when we get into SmartView. The first thing you'll notice when you log into SmartView is it's a different login screen. So it's not your traditional little login screen that pops up. It opens up basically a website that looks just like the login to PVCS, gives you the identity domain, which you guys will understand what that means once you get into PVCS. But basically you're identifying your cloud instance, and then you log in with your username and password. So now you're going to have a new login screen in SmartView, but then beyond that, you're going to lose some things when you go into the cloud, and this can be a sticking point for clients. The biggest thing you're going to lose is there's no S-Base ad hoc. S-Base ad hoc is gone. So if I'm accustomed to connecting to my planning application as an S-Base user, I got to get that out of my head. I can't do that anymore. And why is that a big deal? Because if you've used planning ad hoc and you've used the S-Base ad hoc, you know that those two things are miles apart in functionality. Now, the planning ad hoc has great functions that S-Base doesn't have, in that it'll display a smart list, it'll display text-based members, it'll display dates, and the S-Base add-in won't, or the S-Base ad hoc won't. Conversely, the S-Base ad hoc is what everybody's used to using now, especially on-prem. It has a different user interface that is far more similar to the old-school S-Base add-in. Now, there is work underway at Oracle today to fix that and to make those two things look very similar, but that hasn't happened yet. Once that happens, I think that this will be far less of a detriment, and that users will be far more easily convinced to make that transition. But it's something to keep in mind as you start to migrate and plan your migration to the cloud. The other thing you have to consider is if you're going to do a hybrid implementation where you're keeping HFM on-prem and you might keep S-Base around on-prem, that means we're going to have multiple connections inside of SmartView itself between your pod, between your PVCS pod and your HFM and S-Base applications. And depending on how many of those applications exist in on-prem versus the cloud will kind of determine the path that we take. So if you've got HFM and you've got S-Base and you've got a lot of different applications that are there, we might say, hey, use your shared connections the way you've always done it on-prem, and we'll set up a private connection for your planning instance on the cloud. Conversely, if most of your users are going to be in the cloud and on planning we only have HFM for 1 or 2 people or 10 people, then maybe we'll set up a private connection for them. So that we'll figure that out on kind of a case-by-case basis. So with that, we'll switch gears a little bit and go into an actual case study of an implementation we recently sent to the cloud. So WPX Energy, they're out of Tulsa, and they were actually spun off from Williams, and they inherited a bunch of Hyperion applications. That includes HFM, FDM, planning, and S-base. So they actually had two planning applications, one S-base application, an HFM application, and then all the data management stuff on the back end. So they were in need of an upgrade. They're on an older version, 11.121, and they were kind of at a crossroads. Do we continue with on-prem and reinvest in that, or do we go to the cloud? And their IT group was, their strategy currently for IT is basically, hey, we're going to the cloud. So if you can send this application, send it to the cloud. So that meant we had to take 3 applications and consolidate those into one E-PBCS application. So how did we do that? So we were able to basically go through and say, okay, we've identified that you have 2 independent planning applications. So we need to figure out how many plan types that means we need. And then we also see that you have 1 S-base application. So we have to take those and figure out a way to combine all of those together. So with some luck on this account, we were lucky that we were able to rationalize it into essentially 3 plan types. And this let us fit it all into one single planning application that we could just give users access to. So that meant we were going to be able to migrate planning using LCM. Now, it wasn't quite that simple because we had to migrate, which application has the lion's share of the information, and then what are we going to layer on from the other planning application. That also meant we had BSO cubes and converted it into a full-blown plan type. What we also did as we did that was we converted that, not just the cube itself, we also gave it a variety of additional functionality around drivers and things like that. So we were able to enhance the application as we were going. We also had a variety of automation pieces that had to be rebuilt. So if we look at SQL-based load rules, so they had data that was going from HFM into S-base and planning. So we had to take, and they were using extended analytics. So we had to take all of those extended analytics pulls, which we could still do in extended analytics, but then we had to convert those over to flat file loads after we download it. So we get the data from the relational repository, we convert it to a flat file, and now we're ready to implement, to push that up to the cloud using data management. We also implemented on this project external security. So this process was relatively straightforward, but it requires some infrastructure and some knowledge on your IT side. So you're going to be leveraging IT for a time period on this. Now, the overall investment of how long does it take to set this up and get it configured and debug it, honestly, in total, we've probably spent less than 10 hours of the project on external authentication, so it's not a big undertaking, but it does require some knowledge and some IT time. And even on the IT side, I would say that their investment in time is probably still, maybe 10 hours total. But this client, as I stated earlier, the WPX was already set up and ready to go on cloud. That was one of their IT strategies. So they had already set up their external authentication to work with a variety of cloud tools. So for them, the amount of work that was required was relatively low because this was just another tool that they were going to be talking to. And since it's an industry standard, all we had to do, they sent us an XML file, we upload that XML file to PVCS, and the PVCS gives us another XML file that we then send back to IT, and that's how the handshake works. So once those 2 things are configured, then we had a few hiccups here and there and log out and things like that. But overall, it was a pretty straightforward and simple process. I was very pleased with the end results of how easy that was. And then the last piece that we have to do when we go to the cloud is extensive testing. We need to make sure that things still work the way that we expect them to. And we would do this even if we were going from 11.121 to 11.124 because they are different products. If we're going 11.124 to the cloud, they're probably a lot more similar, so that maybe we don't have to do quite as much testing. But in general, we want to go through and perform, really, if we can, a full UAT on the system. If we've got the time and money to invest in that, it's a worthwhile investment. So finally, we've got our results. So our results basically ended up with a cloud-based tool that took all of their on-prem planning and S-based tools and sent it to the cloud. And that was all great. But we ran into some challenges. Our biggest challenge was around data. And one of the plan types that we were implementing, they were doing a 20-year model of well economics into the future. Well, 20 years of data is kind of a lot of data. Yeah, and on-prem, it's not that big of a deal because we have some flexibility where we can just go pull it out of their system and push it in through either a load rule or something like that can be pretty fast. So the first thing we tried was, okay, well, we'll treat this like it's a load rule. We'll go use FDMEE. We'll define our input format, and we'll go load some data in. What we found was with as many columns as we were talking about, FDMEE, for whatever reason, struggled a lot from a performance perspective. And what we ended up determining was that we could instead take that data and convert it over to a column-based S-based native format and use the native S-based functionality. And what was a 15-hour load, literally, turned into a 15-second or 15-minute load. So it was fractional in the amount of time that was required to load it from a native user versus native S-based versus FDMEE. And to a certain extent, we expect some of that. FDM has a lot of overhead associated with it, so the data management piece has all that auditability, all of that flexibility overhead, and quite that much of a drain on the overall performance. Another issue we had was, existing users, they use the S-base add-in, or if they weren't using the S-base add-in, they were using the S-base ad hoc functionality of SmartView. So those users did have to transition over and get used to using planning ad hoc. And as I stated before, planning ad hoc is a pretty big departure from what we do traditionally inside of SmartView. So it's a lot different. But they were eventually able to get used to it, and they're using the system now, and they're very happy, and they're glad to be on the cloud and start that transition, because this is kind of step one for them. Eventually they're hoping that they can get consolidations and account reconciliation and get everything into the cloud.